Well, with me to discuss Vladimir Putin and the other foreign policy highlights of the G20 is Dr. Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy. Dr. Fullilove, what do you think that Vladimir Putin is hoping to get out of this meeting?
I think for Mr. Putin, this meeting is about politics. It's not about economics. He's aiming to show the world that the world can't organise a global meeting of world leaders and exclude him, regardless of how bad he's behaved, regardless of how bad his regime has behaved. That's why he's here, despite what might embarrass someone like you or me. That's why he's here. That's why he sent the Russian Navy in advance too.
How much pressure do you think he'll be under from the international community during this meeting about the war in Ukraine and even possibly over the MH17 crash site?
Not much, unfortunately, partly because the G20 meeting is primarily about economics, but also because time has elapsed since the downing of MH17, and Mr. Putin has ridden out the storm. I think that's what he would think. He would say that Russia has shown you can bluster and you can demonstrate there are limits to the pressure that the world can put on a state that has 4,000 nuclear warheads.
The world was pretty stunned by the historic deal that was announced this week between the US and China on climate change. Climate change isn't officially part of the agenda at the G20, but how much of a talking point do you think it will be?
I think it will be a talking point. As you say, the G20 is primarily an organisation about economic cooperation for growth, and the government has done its level best to keep it disciplined and keep it focused on that task, and I understand that to a certain extent. But climate change is an economic issue. There's been a huge agreement between the leaders of the two biggest economies, the two biggest carbon emitters. I think leaders do what they want to do. Leaders discuss what they want to discuss, and I think they will want to discuss climate change.
Does the US-China deal put any pressure on Australia over its climate policy?
I hope it puts pressure on all major emitters because this is a big step forward to get some agreement between the United States and China. We're now looking ahead to these talks in Paris. We're hoping that they succeed where Copenhagen failed. And so, yes, I think Australians' minds will be focused on our negotiating position as we go into Paris, but also on our domestic policy. Do we have the right domestic policy to achieve the kinds of carbon emission cuts we may be called upon to make?
You've said it's mostly focused on economics, of course, but what do you think are the other key foreign policy challenges for the G20?
Well, for me, the mood music around the summit is going to be as interesting as the summit itself. And we have dueling speeches from President Obama tomorrow in Brisbane, where I think a lot of Asia is going to see whether Obama wants to reboot the rebalance. I think people have been a bit disappointed by the rebalance, so will he recommit to it? And then on Monday, you have President Xi Jinping speaking to the Australian Parliament. And I think the world will be looking at that to see is the sort of new moderate China you've seen in the last week or two, with a warming of relations with Japan, this big climate deal with the United States. Is that the kind of China Xi Jinping wants to lead, or is it the more combative, more muscular, more forward-leaning kind of foreign policy he's run? And then you have a speech by Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, to the Lowy Institute on Monday. She's a critical player in the West's relations with both Russia and China. So you've got all the formal stuff that will happen in those convention centres in Brisbane, but you also have the coincidence of all these big world leaders speaking in Australia to Australian audiences, but also to the world.
Well, are we in any sort of Australian moment? Because, you know, Australia's president of the G20 at the moment. We're president of the United Nations Security Council.
I think we are in a bit of a moment. We don't want to be too triumphalist about it, but it might be time for Australia to stop talking itself down. We are a large economy. We're a significant country. We're at the two most important tables in the world, the Security Council on security and political issues, the G20 on economic issues, and it's time, I think, we back ourselves and regard ourselves as a player, not always as a commentator on these issues.
Okay, Dr. Michael Fullilove from the Lowy Institute, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Leigh.